Welcome back to the show, Seth. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Seth?
Good. I know you're in LA now, but you were in New York right before this all started. Were you at least behaving safely when you were in New York back in February?
I was trying. I was at a giant charity event, so it was hard to behave safely, and it was just there was like rumblings of it in the air. So I at moments would just hand myself over to like normal behavior, and I shook 200,000 people's hands at the event, and um, and Martha Stewart was there, and I don't want to support any conspiracy theories, but she had just gotten back from China where the virus was at that moment very active, and she left because of the virus, and was sharing this information in a face-to-face conversation, at which moment I was like, Martha Stewart, back away from me, please. But yeah, it was, but if I was to get it from Martha Stewart, it would have been
Oh
completely
yeah, because
best,
it would be
case scenario.
artisan vibe.
Exactly.
This movie, which is fantastic, is based on a short story by Simon Rich, who also wrote the screenplay. He was a writer at SNL, and I had forgotten a couple things. One, that he wrote your monologue the first time you hosted SNL, and two, that you were only 23 years old the first time you hosted SNL, which is incredibly young.
Yeah, I was, and I think Simon was actually around the same age, but although he looked maybe 9 years old, I think.
Yeah, he was. He maybe looks 23 now.
Exactly. But yeah, and it was really alarming to me that my monologue was not even conceived of. And Saturday afternoon, I think, was approaching. And again, as a 23-year-old young man who grew up watching SNL and wanted to make a good impression, I was really, really, really nervous. And then Simon, this kid, this guy who seemed, again, like a child, came up and handed me this thing. Hey, man, I wrote this. And I read it, and it was like word for word, like perfect. I literally didn't change one thing. And I remember thinking, if this guy ever writes a movie about a guy who gets pickled, I'd love to be in it.
I went, after working there a long time, and when I went back and hosted, I had this whole new respect for what we put hosts through, because there was this sense of, oh, the monologue, we can push it off, forgetting that when you actually have to host a show and it's the first time you're going to talk to the audience, you'd really like to have it under control by like Monday, Tuesday, ideally.
You like to have some sense of what the first things you're going to be expected to say are. Yes. But I've since detached. It is Lauren who said, we don't do the show because it's ready. We do it because it's Saturday at 11:30, which are very impactful words on me.
Yes. So impactful that I think
he
said it maybe a million times.
Exactly. But I apply it to non-SNL things, which I don't know if it works, but I think it does.
Your monologue, for those who don't remember, because it was a long time ago now, was the sort of idea behind it was you reading a monologue you had written when you were 13 that you wanted to do if you ever hosted SNL, but you were actually doing stand-up as a 13-year-old. This was not a crazy idea. What was your material like when you were 13?
It was 13-year-old stuff. It was, I would write about my grandparents. That was the first joke I ever wrote. It was my grandparents. I would go watch TGIF at their house every Friday while my family went to synagogue, and I didn't want to go. And they would argue about, they were both deaf, and they would argue with each other. And those were my first jokes I wrote. It was like my grandparents arguing with each other and not knowing what the other person was arguing about.
This is a movie about our ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents. The premise of the film is that you play both yourself in modern day and yourself from 100 years ago, your great-grandfather, who was pickled and preserved at a pickle factory. And so basically you're playing two versions of yourself, but one from a century earlier.
Yes. It was weird. It was not a choice I made lightly, because there is not, I'd say there's a spotty tradition of actors playing two roles in a film, but I honestly felt like it really helped the narrative. That's what convinced me, honestly, in the end. And this idea of, if we met our grandparents when they were the same age as us, what would they think of us? Would they like us? My grandparents barely tolerated me as my grandparents. Like, my grandfather was a tough man. He was a plumber. He was in the war, you know, and he had no time for my modern, you know, my modern crap. Like it was not entertaining to him. I remember once I was a kid, my toenail was too long and I asked him to help me cut it and he ripped my entire toenail off.
I was also, because there's also there's a great amount of heart in this film as well. It's an incredibly silly concept. There's fantastic jokes. But, you know, there's this idea of, like, can a previous generation be proud of, you know, the next generation, even though they're doing different things and different accomplishments. I read an interview with you today where you were saying that your grandparents were never that impressed with your success, but still would be super psyched to go to a McDonald's.
Yeah, they would steal napkins. That was my my grandmother stole everything. And that was to her, like, no, her greatest accomplishments were the things, like, we would go to dinner and literally you'd see her being like, this is a nice plate. And then you'd go to her house the next day and she would have the plate because she would put it in her purse. And so they really coveted things like napkins and plates. And so, like, the fact that I had, like, a whole closet full of, like, paper towel rolls was, like, very impressive to my grandparents. But the fact that I was in movies, they would always be like, you think you're a big shot? You think you're a big shot? That was their favorite expression.